The sun was a merciless hammer over the Carson spread, beating the color from the sky and baking the vast plains of West Texas into a cracked, red-brown canvas. It was a land of brutal honesty, where life and death were spelled out in the stark lines of a canyon wall or the sudden shadow of a circling hawk. For Luke Carson, 24 years of age and born to this unforgiving earth, the land was both his inheritance and his cage. He rode his buckskin gelding, Dusty, along the northern fence line. His eyes narrowed against the glare. They were the eyes of a man older than his years, a pale, watchful blue that had seen the flash of gunfire and the stillness that followed. His face, tanned to the color of worn leather, was a mask of quiet composure, the kind a man learns to wear when emotion is a luxury he can't afford. His hands, resting easy on the pommel of his saddle, were scarred and calloused from rope, rain, and the rough timber of this life. He was his father's son, strong, capable, and silent but beneath the surface. A restless current pulled at him, a yearning for a horizon that wasn't fenced in by duty. The Carson Ranch was a kingdom of dust and cattle, carved from the wilderness by the iron will of his father, old Jedediah Carson. Jedediah was a patriarch in the truest sense, a man who measured worth in acres and head of cattle, who saw his son not as a man, but as the future steward of his legacy. He'd built an empire and expected Luke to rule it, but Luke felt the weight of that empire like a yoke. He'd fought alongside his father to defend it from rustlers and rivals, had buried friends who'd fallen for it, and every sunrise felt less like a new day and more like another turn of the same wheel. He dreamed of places he'd only heard of in whispers from passing drifters, the cool, green mountains of Oregon, the promise of gold in the Black Hills anywhere but here, where his father's shadow was as long and unyielding as the midday sun. His patrol was a mindless ritual, a way to occupy his hands while his thoughts drifted. He checked for breaks in the wire, for the tracks of coyotes or the more dangerous sign of a two-legged predator. The silence of the plains was broken only by the creak of his saddle and the low hum of insects in the parched grass. As he neared the cottonwood grove that huddled around Willow Creek, a sliver of life in the arid landscape, he dismounted, letting Dusty drink from the slow-moving water. The shade of the trees was a small mercy, and for a moment he closed his eyes, the weariness of his soul settling deep in his bones. That's when he heard it. Not a coyote, not a deer, a splash, followed by a soft sound. A sigh of pure relief that was so profoundly human it felt entirely out of place in this wilderness. Every instinct honed by years of survival screamed at him to be cautious. He drew his Colt Peacemaker, the movement fluid and silent, and crept forward through the dense undergrowth. His heart beat a steady, low drum against his ribs. He expected to find a drifter, maybe a rustler trying to water stolen stock. He moved to the edge of the thicket, peering through a curtain of leaves, and the world stopped. It wasn't a rustler. It was a woman. No, a girl, really. She stood in the middle of the creek, the water swirling around her waist, her back to him. The sun, filtering through the cottonwood leaves, dappled her skin with light, making it seem impossibly white, like fresh cream or the petals of a desert lily. Her hair, a cascade of dark chestnut, was pinned loosely atop her head, but stray tendrils curled damply against her neck. She cupped her hands, lifting water and letting it run over her shoulders, her movements slow and graceful. Luke's breath caught in his throat. He'd seen women, of course, the painted ladies in the saloons in dusty Fort Griffin, the weary, work-worn wives of neighboring ranchers, the prim and proper daughters of the town preacher. But he had never seen anything like this. It was a vision of such unguarded innocence, such startling purity, that it felt like a profanity to witness it. He was a trespasser on holy ground. His first impulse was to back away, to melt back into the woods and leave her to her solitude. It was the honorable thing to do. But his feet were rooted to the spot, his eyes held captive, He saw the travel-stained dress and worn boots discarded on the creek bank, the small, pathetic bundle that likely held all her worldly possessions. She was a stranger, alone and vulnerable, yet there was nothing weak about her. As she turned slightly to wash her face, he saw her profile: a straight nose, a firm chin, lips set in a line of weary determination. Even in this moment of private relief, she carried herself with a kind of defiant pride. He saw the faint lines of hardship around her eyes, the slenderness of a frame that had known hunger. She was from the East. Her clothes and the fineness of her features spoke of a different world, a world of green lawns and paved streets, a world she had clearly left far behind. What could have driven a girl like her to this harsh, unforgiving place, all alone? The thought was a jolt, breaking the spell. A girl alone was prey, for men far worse than him, for men like Jacob Cole, their neighbor to the west, whose greed was as vast as the land he coveted. The thought of Cole or his leering ranch hands stumbling upon this scene sent a cold spike of fury through him. He had to leave, now. To stay any longer was a violation, a theft of a moment that did not belong to him. He forced himself to move, stepping back as silently as a ghost. Each step was a battle. He felt a profound, aching shame for his intrusion. Yet the image was already burned into his mind, seared there like a brand. The sight of her, a fragile beacon of purity in his world of dust and blood, had stirred something deep inside him, a protective instinct so fierce it startled him. He made his way back to Dusty, his mind in a turmoil. He swung into the saddle, his movement stiff, and reined the horse away from the creek, giving the cottonwood grove a wide berth. He did not look back. He didn't need to. The image was with him, as clear and vivid as the sun in the sky, the pale shoulders, the dark, wet hair, the quiet dignity of a girl washing away the sins of the road in a hidden creek. He rode on, the familiar rhythm of his patrol doing nothing to soothe his disquiet. Who was she? And what in God's name was she doing on Carson land? Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Mary Lou Hayes felt the cool water as a blessing, a baptism that washed away days of grit and grime from the stagecoach trail. The dust had been a constant companion, a fine red powder that coated her tongue, lined her throat, and settled into every seam of her worn serge dress. At 19, she was an orphan, her parents taken by a fever that had swept through their small Pennsylvania town 2 years prior. All she had left was a faded letter from a great-aunt she'd never met, a woman named Elspeth who had married a rancher and moved to Texas a lifetime ago. The letter, her only map, gave the name of a town redemption and the vague direction of a ranch somewhere to the north. Hope, she was discovering, was a much heavier thing to carry than a single carpet bag. The stage had left her in redemption, a sorry collection of unpainted wooden buildings huddled together as if for protection against the endless expanse of land. The people's faces were hard, their eyes suspicious. When she'd asked about her great-aunt Elspeth, she'd been met with blank stares and shrugs. No one had heard the name. After 2 days of fruitless inquiries and dwindling funds, a wave of cold, terrifying despair had washed over her. She was utterly alone. But Mary Lou was not one to surrender. Her father, a stern but loving blacksmith, had forged a spine of steel in his only daughter. Pride was all she had left, and she wielded it like a shield, unwilling to accept charity or the predatory offers of work from the saloon owner. She'd used her last few coins to buy a small loaf of bread and a map of the surrounding ranches. She would find this place herself. Now, 2 days into her journey on foot, that pride was being sorely tested. The sun was a relentless enemy, the landscape a terrifying, featureless ocean of grass and rock. She had followed the creek, knowing it was her only sure source of water, but her confidence was fraying with every mile. The secluded grove had felt like a gift from Providence. The cool, shaded water was an irresistible temptation, after ensuring she was completely alone. listening until the only sounds were the birds and the wind. She had stripped off, dressed again in her tired, dusty clothes. Mary Lou felt the brief comfort of the creek water evaporate under the relentless Texas sun. A clean body in dirty clothes was a small, almost cruel, improvement. The moment of peace was over, and the vast, silent landscape pressed in on her once more. She stood at the edge of the cottonwood grove, a tiny, solitary figure against an endless backdrop of red earth and pale sky, and forced herself to make a decision. Her hand-drawn map, copied from the one in the Redemption Land office, was a fool's errand. The penciled squares representing ranches and the squiggly lines for creeks bore little resemblance to the rolling, deceptive terrain before her. She chose the path that seemed to follow the creek north. Her logic simple and desperate. Water meant life, and life meant people. Every rustle in the tall grass sent a jolt of fear through her. Every shadow seemed to morph into a threat. The silence was an active, listening thing, and she felt as if the land itself was watching her, judging her intrusion. Her pride, which had been her shield, was beginning to feel thin and brittle. She was tired, hungry, and more lost than she had ever been in her life. The steel in her spine was beginning to feel like a heavy, burdensome weight. She had been walking for what felt like hours, the sun moving past its zenith, when the sound of a horse broke the stillness. Her heart leaped into her throat. She froze, instinctively ducking behind a cluster of mesquite bushes, her hand flying to the small, ineffective penknife in her pocket. She peered through the thorny branches, her breath held tight in her chest. A rider was approaching. Not fast, but with the steady, ground-eating pace of a man who knew his destination. It was the same man from the fence line, the one she had sensed earlier, the man from the creek. A hot flush of shame and fear washed over her. Had he seen her? He must have. The thought was a profound violation, a stripping away of the one private moment of grace she had allowed herself. He rode a handsome buckskin, and he sat in the saddle with an easy, innate authority that spoke of a life spent on horseback. As he drew nearer, she saw his face more clearly. It was a hard face, not cruel, but shaped by the sun and the wind into an expression of stoic neutrality. His eyes, a startling pale blue, swept the landscape, missing nothing. He wore his gun low on his hip, the leather of the holster worn smooth from use. He was everything she had been taught to fear about the men of this wild country, powerful, armed, and utterly self-contained. He reined in his horse a good 50 yards away, his gaze fixed on the mesquite bushes where she was hiding. He didn't draw his weapon, but he didn't need to. His stillness was more intimidating than any threat. "You can come out," he said. His voice was a low baritone, calm and without inflection. It wasn't a request. "Coyotes get bold this time of day. You're safer in the open." Mary Lou's mind raced. To run was impossible. To stay hidden was to invite whatever fate he chose for her. With a deep breath, she straightened her shoulders, pushed a stray strand of hair from her face, and stepped out from behind the bushes. She would not show him her fear. Luke watched her emerge, his face unreadable. It was her, the girl from the creek. Up close. She was smaller than he'd imagined, and the exhaustion was etched deeply onto her face, leaving pale smudges beneath her large, dark eyes. But those eyes met his directly, and there was no plea in them, only a fierce, guarded pride. The sight of her, so defiant in her vulnerability, tightened something in his chest. "This is private land," he stated, his voice still level. "I am aware," she replied, her own voice clearer and steadier than she felt. "I seem to have lost my way. I was looking for the home of a relative." He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. "Who would that be?" "Her name is Elspeth Miller. She married a rancher many years ago. I was told her property was somewhere north of Redemption." Luke was silent for a moment. running the name through his mind. He knew every family, every brand. Within 100 miles. Never heard of her, he said, the words flat and final. No millers in this part of the county, except for the town blacksmith, and he ain't married to anyone named Elspeth. The words struck Mary Lou with the force of a physical blow. It was the final, devastating confirmation of her utter solitude. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and for a terrifying second, the world tilted. She swayed on her feet, her vision blurring at the edges. In an instant, Luke was out of the saddle and moving toward her, covering the distance in 3 long strides. He stopped just short of touching her, but his presence was a solid, looming wall. "You all right, miss?" The concern in his voice, faint as it was her undoing. The dam of her composure cracked. She wouldn't cry, she would die before she cried in front of this stranger, but she couldn't stop the tremor that ran through her. She wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture of self-preservation. "I am fine," she managed to say, the words tasting like ash. Luke looked at the merciless sun, then at her pale face. He saw the cracked leather of her shoes, the desperate hope dying in her eyes. Leaving her here was a death sentence, whether by dehydration, a rattlesnake, or men less constrained by honor than he was. She wouldn't last the night. The memory of her in the creek, pure and unguarded, rose in his mind, and with it, that same fierce, inexplicable surge of protectiveness. "You can't stay out here," he said, his tone shifting back to one of quiet command. "The ranch house is a few miles east. You can get a meal and some water. We'll figure things out from there." Mary Lou looked at him, her mind a whirlwind of distrust and desperation. Go with him. A strange man, into the heart of a wilderness she didn't understand. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed no. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw no guile, no predatory intent. She saw only a calm, weary practicality. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that he was right. Her other options had dwindled to none. "Thank you," she said, the words barely a whisper. "Can you ride?" She shook her head. "I've never been on a horse." Luke considered this for a second, then gave a curt nod. He walked back to his horse, grabbed his canteen, and handed it to her. "Drink," he commanded. The water was warm, but it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. While she drank, he unfastened his bedroll from behind his saddle. "You'll ride in front. Hold on to the pommel. Don't touch the reins." He helped her up, his grip on her arm firm and impersonal. The world pitched and swayed as she settled awkwardly in front of the saddle. He swung up behind her with an easy grace, and she felt the solidness of his body at her back. The heat of him, a startling, unnerving presence. He was careful not to press against her, but the proximity was overwhelming. She could smell the scent of leather, dust, and something else, something clean and masculine, like fresh-cut timber. She gripped the saddle horn until her knuckles were white as he nudged Dusty into a walk. The journey was made in silence. Mary Lou was acutely aware of the man behind her, of the steady rhythm of his breathing, the sheer power contained in his quiet frame. She watched the land pass by, seeing it now not as an empty void, but as a kingdom. This was his world. Long-horned cattle stared at them with placid, dark eyes, bearing a brand she didn't recognize. The fences were well mended, the land well managed. This was no struggling homesteader's claim. This was an empire. Finally, they crested a low rise, and she saw it. The ranch house was a 2-story structure made of thick, dark logs and river stone, built to withstand a siege. It was surrounded by a collection of barns, corrals, and a bunkhouse, all of it neat and orderly. Smoke curled from a massive stone chimney. It was a declaration of power and permanence in a land defined by transience. As they rode into the main yard, a figure detached himself from the shadows of the porch. He was an older man, built on the same large scale as his son, but where Luke was lean and hard. This man was solid, immovable, like a granite boulder. His hair and beard were a wiry, iron gray, and his eyes, the same pale blue as Luke's, were chips of ice. He held himself with an air of absolute, unquestioned authority. This had to be the father, the rancher Carson. Luke reined in and dismounted before helping Mary Lou down. She stumbled, her legs unsteady, and Luke's hand shot out to steady her, his grip strong on her elbow. He released her as soon as she found her balance. "Luke," the old man's voice was gravelly, a sound that could strip bark from a tree. "What's this?" His eyes raked over Mary Lou, taking in her worn dress, her exhausted state, her unkempt hair. It was not a look of curiosity, but of appraisal and immediate dismissal. "Found her on the North Range," Luke said. His tone clipped. "She's lost. Was looking for a relative." "This ain't a charity for strays," Jedediah Carson said, his cold gaze still fixed on Mary Lou. "We've got work to do. The South herd needs moving before that storm front comes in." "She needs water and a meal, Pa," Luke countered, his voice quiet but with an edge of steel that Mary Lou hadn't heard before. "She can rest in the old foreman's cabin for the night. We'll take her back to town tomorrow." Before Jedediah could argue, another man stepped out of the main house. He was a stark contrast to the Carsons, where they were rough-hewn and weathered. He was dressed in a fine, tailored coat and clean, polished boots. He was handsome in a sharp-featured way, with dark, clever eyes and a smile that didn't quite reach them. "Well now, Jedediah, Luke," the man said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "Don't tell me you're turning away a lady in distress. That's not very neighborly." He let his gaze drift over to Mary Lou, and it was a physical, invasive thing. He looked at her not as a person, but as one might inspect a fine piece of horseflesh he was considering buying. "Jacob Cole," he introduced himself, tipping his hat to her. "And who might you be, Little Dove?" Mary Lou stiffened at the familiar term, her chin lifting. "My name is Mary Lou Hayes." "Mary Lou," Cole repeated, savoring the name. "A long way from home. I'd wager—" "Don't you worry. You've fallen into good hands here. The Carsons are pillars of this community." The words were complimentary, but his tone held a subtle mockery that Luke caught instantly. Luke stepped slightly, placing himself between Cole and Mary Lou. "She's under my protection, Jacob," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Cole's smile widened, a flash of white teeth. "Of course she is, Luke, of course she is." He turned his attention back to Jedediah. "As I was saying, Jedediah, that parcel of land bordering my west pasture, I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer. More than generous." Jedediah grunted, his attention torn. The mention of land, his one true passion, was a powerful lure. He looked from his son's obstinate face to the girl's proud, weary one, and then to Jacob Cole's predatory smile. He saw nothing but trouble. This girl, this complication, had arrived at the worst possible time, bringing with her the unwelcome attention of his most avaricious neighbor. Mary Lou stood frozen, caught in the crossfire of their silent, powerful wills. Jedediah Carson's open hostility was like a physical force, pushing her away. Jacob Cole's slick, possessive interest felt like a slimy web beginning to encircle her. And Luke stood like a stone wall, his motives a complete mystery. He had saved her from the wilderness, only to bring her to a place that felt even more dangerous. She was no longer just lost. She was a piece on a board, in a game whose rules she did not know, played by men who saw her as nothing more than an unexpected complication or a potential prize. Jedediah Carson, in a rare act of concession that was more a dismissal than a kindness, had pointed Mary Lou toward the old foreman's cabin. It stood 100 yards from the main house, a small, solitary structure of sun-bleached logs chinked with dried mud. It was little more than a single room with a stone hearth, a narrow cot, and a rickety table. But to Mary Lou, it was a fortress. It offered privacy, a door she could bar, and a space to breathe away from the suffocating power struggles of the main house. Luke had brought her a plate of food from the cookhouse stew and hard biscuits, along with 2 blankets and a bucket of fresh water. He'd said nothing, his face as impassive as ever, but his actions were a quiet counterpoint to his father's open disdain. He left her at the door, melting back into the dusk of the ranch yard, leaving her to the silence and the unfamiliar sounds of the Texas night. Days bled into one another, marked by the rising and setting of the relentless sun. Luke had promised to take her back to redemption, but the promised tomorrow never seemed to arrive. A herd needed moving. A barn roof needed mending. 100 vital tasks of the ranch always intervened. Mary Lou knew she was being tolerated, not welcomed. A problem Jedediah Carson preferred to ignore, but her pride would not let her be idle. She was not a stray dog to be fed scraps from the table. She began to work. She started by cleaning her small cabin until it was spotless. Then she ventured to the cookhouse, offering to help the grizzled, one-eyed cook, a man named Silas. He regarded her with suspicion at first, but her quiet persistence and willingness to peel potatoes, scrub pots, and haul water eventually earned his grudging respect. He started leaving a fresh cup of coffee for her on the stove each morning. It was the first gesture of acceptance she had received. She saw Luke mostly from a distance. He was a whirlwind of controlled energy, always moving, his presence a constant, reassuring hum in the background of ranch life. He was in the corrals before sunrise, breaking a stubborn colt, his voice low and steady as he gentled the frightened animal. He rode out for long days on the range, returning after sunset covered in dust, his face etched with a weariness that went bone deep. Their interactions were brief and practical. One afternoon, she saw him struggling alone to stretch a new length of barbed wire, the spool heavy and awkward. Without a word, she walked over, picked up a pair of heavy leather gloves she'd found, and took hold of the stretching tool. He looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his blue eyes, but simply nodded. They worked together for the next hour in a comfortable, productive silence. The rhythmic creak of the stretcher and the snap of the staples, the only sounds between them. When they were finished, he looked at the taut, straight line of new wire. "Good work," he said, the 2 words a greater compliment than a flowery speech. Another day, she found him in the small barn, tending to a newborn calf that had been rejected by its mother. The tiny creature was weak, shivering despite the heat. Luke was patiently trying to get it to take milk from a rag soaked in a bucket. Mary Lou knelt beside him. "Let me," she said softly. Her touch was gentler, her fingers smaller. She dipped the rag and brought it to the calf's mouth, stroking its neck, murmuring to it in a low, soothing voice. After a few tense moments, the calf began to suckle weakly. Luke watched her, his expression unreadable, but a certain tension seemed to leave his shoulders. They stayed there for a long time, side by side in the hay-scented dimness, working together to save one small, fragile life. These shared moments were like stones dropped into a still pond, sending out ripples that slowly changed the shape of things between them. Mary Lou began to see past the hard, silent exterior to the man beneath. She saw his competence, his deep-seated sense of responsibility, and a quiet kindness he reserved for animals, and she was beginning to suspect, for her. The fear she'd first felt in his presence was replaced by a grudging admiration, which slowly warmed into a fragile, tentative trust. For Luke, Mary Lou was a quiet revelation. He had expected a helpless city girl, another mouth to feed, a problem to be solved. Instead, he found a woman of surprising strength and quiet dignity. He watched her carry heavy buckets of water without complaint, her back straight, her jaw set. He saw her talking to the ranch hands, her initial shyness giving way to a polite but firm reserve that commanded their respect. She wasn't trying to be one of them. She was simply being herself, an island of quiet grace in their rough, masculine world. The image of her in the creek had been one of innocence. The reality of her on the ranch was one of resilience. The combination was potent, and it took root in his soul, growing into something he didn't dare put a name to. The sky had been a threatening, bruised purple all afternoon. The air grew heavy and still, charged with an electric tension that made the cattle restless in their pens. By late evening, the storm broke. It was not a gentle rain, but a biblical deluge, a violent assault of wind and water. Rain hammered against the cabin roof like 1,000 tiny fists. The wind howled through the chinks in the logs, a mournful, lonely sound. Mary Lou sat on her cot, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the storm through the single small window. She had never been afraid of storms back in Pennsylvania, but this was different. This was a wild, untamed fury, a raw display of nature's power that made her feel terrifyingly small and exposed. A sudden, blinding flash of lightning lit the world in a stark, blue-white glare, followed an instant later by a crack of thunder so loud it seemed to split the very foundations of the earth. The massive oak tree just outside her cabin exploded, a shower of splinters and fire arcing through the rain. Mary Lou screamed, a raw, involuntary cry of pure terror. The cabin was no longer a fortress. It was a fragile wooden box at the mercy of a raging god. She couldn't stay there. Blinded by panic, she threw open the door and ran. The wind and rain tore at her, plastering her thin cotton dress to her skin in an instant, chilling her to the bone. She didn't think about where she was going. She was simply running from the terror. Toward the only other source of light and life, she could see a single lamp burning in the window of a cabin near the main corrals. Luke's cabin. She burst through his door without knocking, a half-drowned apparition of terror and desperation. "The tree," she gasped, pointing back toward her cabin. "The lightning." Luke was on his feet in an instant, his hand instinctively going to the gun on his hip before he realized who it was. He saw her standing there, soaked to the skin, her hair plastered to her face, shivering uncontrollably. The fear in her eyes was wide and stark. "It's all right," he said, his voice a low, calming rumble that cut through the howl of the storm. "You're safe here." He took her by the arm and led her toward the hearth, where a low fire was burning, casting a warm, flickering glow across the room. The cabin was larger than hers, neat and Spartan. A rifle and a shotgun rested on a rack on the wall. A small stack of books sat on a crate next to his bunk. It was a room of quiet, masculine solitude. "You're soaked," he said, his tone practical. "You'll catch your death." He turned away, rummaging through a wooden chest at the foot of his bunk. He pulled out a thick wool blanket and a man's flannel shirt. "Get out of those wet things. Stand by the fire. I'll fetch some coffee." He was giving her privacy, his back deliberately turned as he moved to the small stove in the corner. Grateful, her fingers numb and clumsy, Mary Lou began to unfasten her sodden dress. The wet fabric clung to her, cold and heavy. She peeled it off, along with her chemise, until she stood in the firelight wearing nothing but her own skin, shivering from both cold and nerves. She quickly wrapped the rough, dry blanket around herself, a cocoon of warmth and safety. She was just pulling the big flannel shirt over her head when a log in the fireplace shifted and collapsed with a loud crack and a shower of sparks. Startled by the sound, Luke turned, a reflexive glance toward the fire, and he saw her. It was only for a second, a fleeting moment suspended in time. The blanket had slipped from her shoulder as she'd raised her arms, and in the flickering orange glow of the fire, he saw the graceful curve of her back, the pale, luminous skin of her shoulder, the vulnerable line of her neck. It was the image from the creek, but this was different. This was not an accident of discovery in the wilderness. this was here, in his home, in the intimate circle of his firelight. It was a vision of profound trust and startling beauty, and it struck him with the force of a physical blow. He turned away instantly, his heart hammering against his ribs, a hot flush rising to his face. "Sorry," he mumbled, his voice thick. Mary Lou quickly pulled the shirt on, clutching the blanket tight around her. She was mortified, but strangely, she was not afraid. In his averted gaze, in the raw hoarseness of his voice, she had seen not leering interest, but a deep, almost painful respect. He had seen her at her most vulnerable, and his instinct had been to protect her from his own eyes. He brought her a tin mug of hot, black coffee. Their fingers brushed as she took it, and a jolt of awareness, as powerful as the lightning outside, passed between them. They stood in silence for a long time, listening to the storm rage outside the sturdy walls of the cabin. The wind howled, the rain lashed down, but inside, in the warm glow of the fire, a new, fragile world was being created. Luke looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the firelight glinting in her dark hair, the way she cradled the warm mug in her hands, the quiet strength that had returned to her eyes now that the immediate terror had passed. And he knew. The thought came to him with the clarity and force of a lightning strike. Rancher's son saw the naked virgin bathing by error. In his cabin he possessed her and chose her forever. It wasn't a thought of ownership, not in the way his father or Jacob Cole owned land and cattle. It was a deeper, more profound realization. In that moment, he felt a connection to her that transcended duty or lust. It was a sense of fierce, unwavering belonging. This was the woman he was meant to protect. This was the heart he was meant to cherish. He had been adrift, bound by a legacy he didn't want. Now, he had found his harbor. He looked at this girl, this brave, proud, resilient orphan who had wandered into his harsh world, and he made a choice. He would not let his father send her away. He would not let Jacob Cole have her. He would stand against the world for her. He had chosen her, forever. The morning after the storm was unnaturally clean. The rain had scrubbed the dust from the air, leaving the sky a vast, aching blue. The scent of wet earth and sage was sharp and clear. But the pristine atmosphere could not wash away the tension that now crackled in the air at the Carson Ranch, a tension as palpable as the electricity before a lightning strike. The fragile peace of the night, cocooned in Luke's cabin, had been an illusion. Daylight brought reality back with a vengeance. The confrontation came at the breakfast table in the main house. Mary Lou had not been invited, but Luke had insisted, walking over to her cabin and stating simply, "You'll eat with us." It wasn't a request. It was a line being drawn in the dirt. She walked beside him into the cavernous dining room, her back straight, her head held high. She wore one of her own dresses, which she had meticulously washed and mended. But it was still the dress of a woman with no means. Jacob Cole was gone, but Jedediah Carson sat at the head of the long oak table, a patriarch on his throne. He didn't acknowledge her presence, his gaze fixed on his son. The silence was a weapon, and he wielded it with practiced skill. Luke pulled out a chair for Mary Lou, a gesture of old-world courtesy that was shockingly out of place in this rough-hewn environment. He then took his own seat opposite her, his movements calm and deliberate. Jedediah finally spoke, his voice a low rumble. "The river's running high. We'll need to move the longhorns from the south pasture before the whole damn thing floods. You'll take 5 men and ride out as soon as you're done." He was speaking to Luke, but his cold eyes were on Mary Lou. The message was clear: the work of the ranch would continue, and she was an irrelevant distraction. "All right," Luke said, his voice even. "After I ride into redemption." Jedediah's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Redemption for what? "To see the marshal," Luke replied, meeting his father's gaze without flinching. "And to send a wire, see if we can find any trace of Miss Hayes's relatives." A humorless smile touched Jedediah's lips. You'll do no such thing. You have your orders. The girl is your problem. You brought the stray in. You can take her back. Leave her in town and be done with it. The word stray hung in the air, sharp and ugly. Mary Lou flinched as if struck, her cheeks burning with humiliation. She stared down at her plate, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. Her name is Mary Lou, Luke said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. And she is not a stray. She's staying. Staying, Jedediah's voice rose, the pretense of calm shattering. Staying as what? A charity case, a cookhouse maid. This is a cattle ranch, not a mission for lost causes. She has no name, no family, no prospects. She is nothing. She is my prospect, Luke said, the words falling into the charged silence with the weight of stones. Jedediah stared at his son, his blue eyes turning to chips of ice. For a moment, Mary Lou thought the old man might lunge across the table. The raw fury in his face was terrifying. Have you lost your senses? You are a Carson. You will marry a woman of standing, a woman with land, with a name, a woman who can strengthen this family, not a penniless drifter who washes up on our land like so much flood debris. I've made my choice, Pa. You have made a fool's choice, Jedediah roared, slamming his fist on the table, making the plates jump. I have spent my life building this place. I've bled for this land, buried men for this land. It is your inheritance, your duty. You will not throw it all away for some nameless piece of baggage. The argument was a raw, open wound, and Mary Lou was the salt being ground into it. She felt a desperate urge to flee, to run back to her cabin, to run until the entire state of Texas was behind her. But she was trapped by the sheer force of their wills. This was not just about her. It was a battle that had been brewing between this father and son for years, and she had become the unwitting catalyst. The standoff was broken by the sound of an approaching rider. A moment later, Jacob Cole strolled into the dining room as if he owned it, a self-satisfied smirk on his handsome face. He took in the scene, Jedediah's purple rage, Luke's stony defiance, Mary Lou's pale distress with a connoisseur's appreciation for conflict. Jedediah, Luke, he greeted them, his voice smooth and untroubled. I hope I'm not interrupting family business. His eyes lingered on Mary Lou. Miss Hayes, you look rested. The country air agrees with you. What do you want? Coal? Luke ground out, his hand resting on the table, unnervingly close to the butt of his pistol. Business, my boy. Always business, Cole said, turning his full attention to the older Carson. Jedediah, I came to follow up on our discussion about that parcel of land and about finding a solution for your current complication. Jedediah shot a venomous look at his son, then gestured curtly to the porch. Outside! As the two older men walked out, Cole cast a final, triumphant glance back at Luke. Mary Lou watched them through the window, saw them standing near the corral, their heads bent together. Cole was talking, his hands moving in expressive, persuasive gestures. Jedediah was listening, his granite face set, occasionally nodding. They were talking about her. She knew it with a sickening certainty. She was being discussed like a plot of land, a commodity to be traded. She felt Luke's eyes on her and looked up to meet his gaze. The anger was gone from his face, replaced by a grim, weary resolve. Don't listen to them, he said quietly. But she couldn't help it. The weight of her situation was crushing. She was the cause of this terrible rift. She was endangering the man who had shown her kindness, turning him against his own father. And she was the object of a land negotiation, a bargaining chip for a man whose smile made her skin crawl. The independence and pride that had carried her across the country felt like a cruel joke. Here in this world of powerful men, her will meant nothing. That night, she couldn't sleep. The argument replayed in her mind, each of Jedediah's cruel words a fresh sting. She thought of Jacob Cole's possessive eyes and the cold, transactional way he had spoken of her. She was a burden, a complication, a piece of baggage. The next morning, she rose with a new, desperate resolve. She would not be defined by these men. She could not fight them with their weapons of land and power, but she could fight with her own. She went to the cookhouse and worked with a feverish intensity, scrubbing, baking, and mending until her fingers were raw. She found Silas's neglected vegetable patch behind the bunkhouse and began, with a fierce determination, to weed and water it, coaxing green life from the hard, red soil. She asked one of the older, kinder ranch hands, a man named Dusty, to show her how to properly mend a saddle strap, and she sat for hours, her brow furrowed in concentration, pushing the heavy needle through the thick leather. She was trying to prove her worth, not just to Jedediah Carson, but to herself. She needed to believe that she was more than the sum of her misfortunes. Each mended shirt, each loaf of fresh bread, each weed pulled was a small act of defiance, a declaration that she had value, that she could contribute, that she was not helpless. Luke saw her efforts, and it tore at him. He saw the proud set of her shoulders and the exhaustion she tried to hide in her eyes. He was locked in a cold war with his father. They barely spoke, and when they did, it was in clipped, angry commands about the ranch. Jedediah was making Luke's life as difficult as possible, assigning him the hardest jobs, a constant, grinding reminder of who held the power. And always, the unspoken threat hung between them: defy me, and you lose everything. A few days later, Luke came to her cabin as dusk was settling over the ranch. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice low. She let him in, her heart pounding with a sense of dread. The small room felt charged with unspoken tension. "You shouldn't have argued with your father on my account," she began, twisting her hands together. "I never meant to cause this kind of trouble between you." "This wasn't about you," he said, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. "This has been coming for a long time." "He's your father. Luke, this is your home, your future. You can't throw that away." She took a deep breath, the words tasting like poison. "Perhaps it would be best if I left. I can find work in town. I'll manage." He looked at her, his pale eyes searching her face in the dim light. "I saw Cole in town today," he said, his voice flat. "He was bragging in the saloon about the deal he offered my father, the Circle C pasture for you." The ugly confirmation of her fears made her feel sick. "So you see," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I am just a thing to be traded. I'm putting you in an impossible position. Let me go, Luke. Let me take the trouble with me." He crossed the small room in 2 strides and took her hands in his. His were rough and calloused, but his grip was surprisingly gentle. "Do you think that's what this is about? A piece of land?" he asked, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "I told my father I made my choice, and I told you that you were safe here. Was I wrong?" "You can't protect me from this," she cried, pulling her hands free. "I don't want to be the reason you lose your birthright." "And what if you're the reason it's finally worth fighting for?" he shot back, his intensity startling her. He took a step closer, his eyes boring into hers. "For years, all I've seen is dirt and cattle, a duty I was born to, a cage I couldn't escape. It was just land. But you're different. You're life." He struggled with the words. A man unaccustomed to bearing his soul. "Having you here, seeing you fight so hard to make your own place, it makes me want to fight too, for something more than just a brand on a cow." He reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching her cheek. "I'm not letting you go, Mary Lou. Not to my father's pride, and damn sure not to Jacob Cole. You are not a burden. You're the only thing that's made sense in this whole God-forsaken place. This is your home now, if you'll have it." Tears she had refused to shed for weeks finally welled in her eyes, not from sorrow or fear, but from a profound, overwhelming relief. He had chosen her, not as a prize, not as a duty, but as a reason. In that moment, the conflicts raging outside the cabin walls seemed to fade. They were two people, alone against a hostile world, but for the first time, they were facing it together. The quiet accord struck in Luke's cabin became the new, unspoken law of the Carson Ranch. It was a fragile truce, a pocket of calm in a war that was far from over. Luke and Mary Lou moved in a shared orbit of quiet understanding. A shared glance across the dusty corral, a brief moment working side by side mending a fence. The simple act of him leaving a freshly picked wild prairie rose on her cabin's windowsill. These small gestures built a world for the two of them, a world separate from the simmering resentment of Jedediah Carson. The old man had retreated into a stony, thunderous silence. He saw his son's choice not as love, but as rebellion. He saw Mary Lou not as a person, but as the symbol of that defiance. He watched her work, her quiet, relentless efforts to earn her place, and saw it only as the cunning of a predator burrowing its way into his legacy. The ranch, once a shared enterprise, was now a fractured kingdom. The attack came on a moonless night, a blanket of impenetrable black velvet thrown over the plains. The air was still and cool. The only sounds the distant yip of a coyote and the soft sighing of the wind through the eaves of the barns. It came not with a roar, but with a whisper of fire. Luke was woken by a smell, acrid, oily, and wrong, kerosene. In the same instant, the night outside his cabin window bloomed with a hungry, hellish orange. He was on his feet before his mind had fully registered the sight, pulling on his boots and grabbing the Winchester from its rack by the door. As he burst outside, the horror hit him with the force of a physical blow. The main stable, a massive structure he had helped his father build timber by timber, was a raging inferno. Flames licked 50 feet into the night sky, and the terrified, high-pitched screams of the horses trapped inside were a sound that would haunt his dreams forever. Ranch hands were spilling from the bunkhouse, shouting, their faces stark and demonic in the firelight. But this was not just arson. The crack of a gunshot split the night, followed by another, pained. Bellowing cries from the cattle pens told him the rest of the story. This was a raid, a deliberate, vicious assault meant to cripple them. "Luke!" a voice screamed. It was Silas, the cook, pointing with a trembling hand toward the main house. "They've got the girl." Luke's blood ran cold. He spun around, his eyes scanning the chaos. He saw them, then 3 riders, their faces obscured by bandanas. 2 were holding back the ranch hands with covering fire. The third, a man with a familiar, confident seat in the saddle, had Mary Lou thrown over his lap. She was struggling, kicking, a flash of her white nightgown, a beacon in the swirling smoke and chaos. Jacob Cole. Rage, pure and blinding, surged through Luke. He raised his Winchester, but the shot was impossible. Cole was using her as a shield. "Cole, you coward!" he roared, his voice drowned out by the fire's roar and the crackle of gunfire. Cole laughed, a sound of pure malice that carried across the yard. "Just collecting on my investment, Carson. Your father was too slow to close the deal." Luke started to run, heedless of the danger, his only thought to get to her. He saw one of Cole's men level a pistol at him. He dodged to the side, raising his own rifle, but he was a fraction of a second too late. A lance of white-hot fire seared through his left shoulder. The impact spun him around, and he went down hard in the dirt, the Winchester clattering from his numb fingers. Through a haze of pain, he pushed himself up onto one knee. He saw Cole spur his horse, galloping out of the yard with Mary Lou. The other 2 riders laid down a final volley of shots before turning to follow, melting into the darkness from which they had come. Luke tried to get to his feet, to go after them, but a wave of blackness washed over him, and the world collapsed. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Mary Lou's world was a nightmare of violent motion and terror. The arm clamped around her waist was like an iron band, crushing the air from her lungs. The heat of the fire on her back gave way to the cold of the night air as they galloped away from the ranch. The man holding her, Jacob Cole, smelled of whiskey and smug satisfaction. "Settle down, little dove," he murmured in her ear, his voice a poisonous slick of triumph. "You're with a man who knows how to appreciate his property now." She struggled, beating her fists against his chest, but it was like striking a stone wall. He only laughed and tightened his grip. They rode hard for what felt like hours, plunging deeper into the dark, rocky badlands west of the Carson spread. The initial, frantic terror began to recede, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged dread. She thought of Luke, of seeing him fall. Was he dead? The thought was an agony so sharp it stole her breath. They finally stopped in a small, hidden box canyon, where a low campfire was already burning. 2 other men, the riders from the ranch, were waiting. Cole dismounted, dragging her roughly from the horse. She stumbled and fell to her knees. "Get her on her feet," Cole ordered. One of the men hauled her up, his grip bruising on her arm. Cole walked over to her, his face illuminated by the fire. The handsome mask was gone, replaced by an expression of raw, possessive greed. He reached out and stroked her cheek with the back of his hand. She flinched away, a gasp of revulsion escaping her lips. "Don't be like that," he said, his smile thin and cruel. "You've just traded up in the world. Old man Carson was going to give you to me for a few acres of scrubland. I decided to expedite the transaction, saves on the legal fees." "You're a monster," she spat, her voice trembling but full of hate. His eyes darkened. "I'm a businessman, and you are the most beautiful asset I've acquired in a long time. You see, I believe a man should take what he wants, and I want you. Luke Carson, he's a boy playing at being a man. He doesn't understand that everything in this world has a price. Your price just happens to be very, very high." He circled her like a wolf inspecting its prey. "Don't get any ideas about that ranch boy coming for you. His shoulder's likely shattered. If he didn't bleed out in the dirt, he won't be in any shape to ride for a month. By then, you'll have learned your place." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that made her skin crawl. "And if you don't, well, there are men in the mining camps, all the way to Santa Fe, who would pay a king's ransom for a girl as spirited and unmarked as you. You'll learn to be grateful for my protection, one way or another." The threat hung in the air, vile and terrifying. It was not a physical blow, but a deep, insidious assault on her spirit. He was trying to strip away her hope, to make her believe she was nothing more than a commodity, her fate to be decided by the highest bidder. But as she looked into his cold, dead eyes, a spark of defiance, forged in the hardship of her journey, refused to be extinguished. She would not break. She would not let him win. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Luke came to on a cot in the bunkhouse. The first thing he was aware of was the pain, a deep, throbbing fire in his shoulder. The second was his father's face, looming over him. Jedediah's expression was a mask of cold, controlled fury. "You're awake," the old man stated. "The bullet went clean through. You were lucky." "Mary Lou," Luke rasped, trying to sit up. The pain was blinding, and he fell back with a groan. "He's gone," Jedediah said, his voice devoid of sympathy. "Taken by the man I was going to give her to. This is the price of your foolishness, boy. This is what happens when you let a stray bitch lead you around by the nose. He didn't just take her. He burned my best stable to the ground and slaughtered 20 head of prize cattle, all for a worthless, nameless girl." "Shut up," Luke whispered, the words raw in his throat. He looked past his father and saw the faces of the ranch hands, grim and silent. "Get me my horse." "You're not going anywhere," Jedediah snarled. "You can barely stand. You'll die out there." "Then I'll die," Luke said, and with a surge of pure will, he swung his legs over the side of the cot. The room spun, and the pain in his shoulder was a blinding, white-hot agony. But he gritted his teeth against it. He looked at his father, and for the first time in his life, Jedediah saw not a son, but a man he did not know. A man forged into something new and unbreakable by the night's fire. "I'm going after her, with or without your help." There was a moment of charged silence, the final, irrevocable breaking of the bond between them. Then Silas, the old cook, stepped forward. "I'll saddle your horse, Luke, and I'll pack you some supplies." Luke, his left arm bound tightly to his chest in a makeshift sling, rode out as the first gray light of dawn was breaking. He was a specter of vengeance, his face pale and drawn with pain, but his blue eyes burned with a cold, righteous fire. He picked up their trail easily, the tracks of 4 horses heading west into the Badlands. Every jolt of the horse was a fresh torment, but he pushed it down, fueled by a single, all-consuming purpose. He tracked them for hours, his focus absolute. He saw where they had stopped, saw the signs of their camp. He was gaining on them. Cole, arrogant and sure of himself, was not moving fast. He believed Luke was out of the fight. It was a fatal mistake. Late in the afternoon, Luke found them. They were making their way through a narrow, winding canyon, the high rock walls providing only one way in and one way out. It was a perfect trap. Dismounting, he tethered his horse and began to climb. His teeth clenched against the screaming protests of his shoulder. He moved with the slow, patient stealth of a predator, making his way up the canyon wall to a rocky ledge that overlooked the trail below. He saw her first. She was riding her own horse now, her hands tied to the pommel. Her head was high, her face a pale mask of defiance. Cole rode beside her, talking to her, a smug look on his face. The other 2 men followed a short distance behind. Luke rested his Winchester on the rock in front of him, the cold metal a comfort against his cheek. He had one good arm. He would have one shot. He waited, his breathing slow and steady, until Cole and Mary Lou were directly below him. "Cole!" he shouted, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. Cole's head snapped up, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. In that split second of shock, Luke fired. He wasn't aiming for Cole, but for the rock face just above him. The bullet struck the stone, sending a shower of rock chips and dust raining down. Cole's horse screamed and reared, throwing him from the saddle. The 2 henchmen scrambled for cover, pulling their guns and firing wildly up at the ledge. Bullets whined past Luke's head, chipping stone near his face. He ignored them, working the lever action of the Winchester with his one good hand, his eyes fixed on Cole, who was staggering to his feet, drawing his pistol. "You're dead, Carson," Cole roared, bringing his gun up. Luke fired again. The bullet took Cole in the chest, spinning him around. A look of profound surprise crossed his face. He took 2 stumbling steps, his gun falling from his hand, and then collapsed into the dust. The 2 henchmen, seeing their leader fall, hesitated for only a second. Then, exchanging a panicked look, they spurred their horses and fled back down the canyon the way they had come. Silence descended, broken only by the nervous stomping of the horses and the sound of Luke's own ragged breathing. Slowly, painfully, he made his way down from the ledge. Mary Lou was already off her horse, working frantically at the ropes binding her wrists. She ran to him as he reached the canyon floor. "Luke, you're hurt," she cried, seeing the blood-soaked sling and the deathly pallor of his face. He looked past her at the still form of Jacob Cole in the dust. Then his eyes met hers, and in them, she saw a love so fierce and protective it took her breath away. "I told you," he whispered, his voice hoarse with pain and exhaustion, "that you were safe with me." And then, his strength finally giving out, he collapsed into her arms. The dead weight of Luke's unconscious body was a terrifying, impossible reality. For a heart-stopping moment, Mary Lou was paralyzed, the echoing silence of the canyon pressing in on her. The girl who had arrived in Texas weeks ago would have panicked, would have dissolved into helpless tears. But that girl was gone, burned away in the fire of the raid and forged into something new in the crucible of her capture. A cold, clear resolve cut through the shock. Luke had saved her life. She would not let him lose his in this dusty, forgotten canyon. Getting him onto his horse. Dusty was a Herculean task. He was a dead weight of muscle and bone, and she was a slender girl running on pure adrenaline. She tried to lift him, her muscles straining, but it was useless. Crying was a luxury she couldn't afford. Thinking was the only tool she had left. She looked at the canyon wall, at the low ledge from which he had made his stand. With gritted teeth, she half dragged, half rolled him to the base of the rock face. Using a low outcrop as a step, she managed to haul his upper body onto the ledge. It was a clumsy, brutal effort, and she sobbed with the strain, whispering apologies to his unhearing form. From there, she brought Dusty alongside the ledge. It took 3 tries, her hands raw and slipping, before she finally managed to heave him over the saddle, slumping him face down like a sack of grain. She tied him precariously in place with a length of rope from Cole's saddle, her knots clumsy but desperate. She took the reins of both horses and began the long walk back. She had no idea how far they were from the ranch, only the direction from which the sun had risen. She put the rising sun to her back and walked east. The journey was a waking nightmare. Every step was a conscious effort of will. The sun beat down, turning the canyon into an oven. Luke moaned sometimes, a low, fevered sound that tore at her heart. But he did not wake. She stopped every hour to give him sips of water from his canteen, forcing the tepid liquid past his dry, cracked lips. She checked his wound, a bloody, ragged tear in the fabric of his shirt, and felt a wave of nausea. She had nothing to dress it with, nothing to stop the slow, steady seep of his lifeblood into the dusty cotton. During that long, torturous walk, the last vestiges of her eastern gentility were stripped away. She was no longer Mary Lou Hayes, the blacksmith's orphaned daughter. She was a creature of this harsh land, her only purpose to keep the man who had chosen her alive. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was no longer in control. It was fuel. She did not think of Jacob Cole's taunts, of his vile threats. To dwell on that was to surrender to the horror, and she could not afford that weakness. The mental violation, the terror of being treated as chattel, had left a deep, invisible wound on her soul. But where Cole had intended to break her spirit, he had instead tempered it. He had shown her the absolute worst of this world, and she had survived it. She had looked into the abyss, and a man had pulled her back. Now, she would pull him back. She was no one's property. She was no one's burden. She was the woman walking a wounded man home. It was late the next day when she saw it, the distant, familiar line of the Carson Ranch buildings shimmering in the heat haze. A sob of pure, unadulterated relief escaped her lips. She was stumbling now, her feet blistered and swollen, her throat a desert of dust. She focused on the ranch house, making it her beacon, and forced one foot in front of the other. Her arrival was not triumphant. She was a ragged, filthy figure leading a horse that carried a half-dead man. The ranch hands who saw her first stopped dead, their mouths agape. One of them, a young cowboy named Billy, let out a yell and ran toward the main house. Silas and Dusty were the first to reach her. They took the reins from her numb fingers, their weathered faces a mixture of awe and grave concern. "Lord God, girl," Silas breathed, his one good eye wide. We thought he was—"
"He's alive,"
Mary Lou said, her voice a dry croak.
"His shoulder, he's lost a lot of blood. He has a fever."
Just then, Jedediah Carson appeared on the porch of the main house. He stood there for a long moment, his face an unreadable slab of granite, and took in the scene his son, slumped over a horse like a casualty of war, and the girl he despised, looking like a ghost who had walked through hell, holding them all together by a thread. He strode toward them, his eyes fixed only on Luke. "Get him down," he commanded the hands. "Take him to his own bed, not the main house. Billy, you ride for the dock in redemption. Tell him it's life or death." The men moved with swift efficiency, gently lifting Luke from the saddle and carrying him toward his cabin. Not once did Jedediah look at Mary Lou. He walked beside his son, his face grim, as if she didn't exist. The dismissal was as profound and cold as the night of the attack. He saw only the consequence, his broken son, and she was the cause. Her bravery, her resilience, her desperate trek across the Badlands meant nothing to him. She was, and would always be, the source of the trouble. But something had changed. As Jedediah walked away, Silas placed a gentle hand on her arm. "You did good, miss," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You brought him home?" Dusty nodded in silent, solemn agreement. The other hands looked at her with a new respect in their eyes. The master of the ranch might not see her, but his men did. The doctor, a weary, whiskey-scented man, arrived hours later. Mary Lou was allowed to wait on the porch of Luke's cabin, but not to enter while he worked. She sat on the steps, refusing to move, until the doctor finally emerged, wiping his bloody hands on a rag. "The boy is strong," he told Jedediah, who had been pacing like a caged wolf. "The bullet is out, the wound is clean now, but the fever is high. The next 2 days will tell the tale. He'll need constant watching. Keep the wound clean. Get broth and water into him if you can." After the doctor left, Jedediah turned, his cold eyes finally falling on Mary Lou. "You've done your damage," he said, his voice low and venomous. "You can take a horse and provisions. Be gone by sunrise." Mary Lou slowly got to her feet. The exhaustion was a physical pain, a crushing weight on her bones, but she stood straight, her chin high. The girl who had flinched at the word stray was gone forever. "No," she said, her voice quiet, but as firm and unyielding as the Texas bedrock beneath her feet. Jedediah stared at her, taken aback by her simple, direct refusal. "What did you say?" "I said no," she repeated, her gaze unwavering. "I am not leaving him." "You have no place here," he snarled. "You are not his wife. You are nothing to him but a fever dream he'll forget when he wakes." "I am the reason he is alive," she stated, not with arrogance, but with the simple finality of truth. "And I will be the one who sees him well. You see me as a burden, Mr. Carson, a piece of property that cost you a barn and some cattle. Jacob Cole saw me the same way, but you're both wrong. I am not a thing to be bought, or traded, or sent away when I become inconvenient." She took a step closer, her small frame radiating a strength that held the powerful rancher in place. "I came to this land with nothing but a name and a foolish hope. I have lost the last of my innocence here. I have been terrified and humiliated. But I have also learned what I am made of. I can work, I can endure, I can fight for what I love. And I love your son." The declaration hung in the cool night air, stark and undeniable. "I am not asking for your charity," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "I am not asking for your name or your land. I am telling you that my place is here, at his side. I will nurse him. I will cook for him. When he is well, I will ride with him and work beside him. I will earn my keep, and I will help him rebuild what was lost. I am no longer a visitor here. Mr. Carson, this is my home now. You will not run me off." Jedediah was speechless. He was a man accustomed to command, to having his will be the absolute law of his domain. He had never been spoken to like this, least of all by a woman, a girl he considered less than nothing. He looked into her eyes and saw not a pleading girl, but a woman as strong-willed and stubborn as himself. He saw the reflection of the same iron that ran through his own veins. And through his son's, he was outmaneuvered, his authority challenged and broken on the rock of her resolve. He said nothing. He simply turned, his back ramrod straight, and strode away toward the main house, leaving her alone in the lamplight on the porch. It was not a victory that brought joy, only a grim, hard-won truce. Mary Lou turned and, without a moment's hesitation, walked into Luke's cabin to begin her vigil. She was no longer a guest, a stray, or a burden. She was a rancher's woman, and she had chosen her place. She had been tested by the worst this land had to offer, and she had not only survived, she had grown into the woman she was always meant to be. The fever broke like a thunderstorm in the dead of night. One moment, Luke was adrift in a searing, red-hued nightmare, haunted by the roar of fire and the chilling echo of Jacob Cole's laughter. The next, he was floating in a cool, quiet darkness, aware of a gentle pressure on his forehead. He blinked, his eyelashes heavy, and the world swam slowly into focus. A single lantern cast a soft, golden glow, pushing the shadows into the corners of his cabin. A figure was sitting on a low stool beside his bunk, Mary Lou. Her head was bowed, her shoulders slumped with an exhaustion so profound it seemed to have settled into her very bones. In her lap, her hands were busy, methodically tearing a clean cotton sheet into strips for bandages. She was keeping watch. He tried to speak, but only a dry, rasping sound emerged from his throat. It was enough. Her head snapped up, and her dark eyes, wide and shadowed with fatigue, met his. A wave of relief so powerful it was almost a physical force washed over her face, erasing the lines of strain for a brief, beautiful moment. "Luke," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread of sound. He managed a nod, the small movement sending a dull, throbbing ache through his shoulder. She was at his side in an instant, a cup of water in her hand. She slid a supporting arm behind his neck, her touch gentle but firm, and helped him raise his head. The cool water was a miracle, soothing the parched desert of his throat. He drank greedily, then sank back onto the pillow, his strength utterly spent. "You're back," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. She smoothed the damp hair back from his forehead, her touch infinitely tender. "You're really back." In the days that followed, Mary Lou became his anchor to the world. Luke's recovery was a slow, frustrating journey from the shores of death back to the land of the living. The fever lingered for days, a smoldering ember that threatened to reignite, and his wound was a constant, burning fire in his shoulder. He was weak, helpless, and for a man accustomed to unbreakable strength, it was a special kind of hell. But through it all, she was there. She was a constant, quiet presence in the small cabin. She bathed his face with cool water, spooned thin, savory broth between his lips, and changed the dressing on his shoulder with a steady, competent hand that belied the faint tremor of her fingers. She never complained, never showed her weariness, though he saw it in the deepening shadows beneath her eyes. She would read to him sometimes in the long afternoons, her voice a low, soothing murmur that was more healing than any of the doctor's tinctures. She read from the small stack of books he kept by his bunk, worn copies of Shakespeare and dog-eared volumes of poetry he had never admitted to anyone that he owned. To hear those familiar words in her voice gave them new life, new meaning. His father never came. Ranch hands would appear at the door with supplies, their gazes a mixture of respect for him and a new, profound awe for Mary Lou. But Jedediah remained in the main house, a silent, brooding monarch nursing his wounded pride. Luke knew a final, uncrossable line had been drawn between them, but he found he didn't care. The world he had once fought to inherit felt distant and unimportant. His entire world was now contained within the 4 log walls of this cabin. As his strength slowly returned, he began to truly see the toll the ordeal had taken on her. He saw the way she would sometimes stare into the distance, her eyes haunted by a memory he could not share, and he knew she was reliving the horror of her capture. He saw the fierce, protective set of her jaw when she thought he was sleeping, a look that said she would stand guard over him against the entire world. The innocent girl from the creek was gone. In her place was a woman of tempered steel, a woman who had walked through fire and emerged stronger. His love for her, once a fierce, protective instinct, deepened into something more, a reverence for her spirit, a profound respect for her strength. One morning, nearly 2 weeks after the raid, Luke managed to get to his feet, leaning heavily on the wall for support. He made his way to the cabin door and looked out. The world seemed bright, new, and painfully sharp. And then he saw it. The great oak tree that had stood sentinel outside his cabin for 100 years was a shattered, blackened ruin, a casualty of the storm that had driven Mary Lou to his door. A massive, splintered branch had fallen against the cabin itself, crushing a section of the roof and splintering the logs of the western wall. The ranch hands had hastily patched it to keep the rain out, but it was a clumsy, temporary fix. The cabin, his sanctuary, was wounded, just as he was. Mary Lou came to stand beside him. "The storm," she said softly. "The night of the storm." Luke looked at the damage, then at the burned-out skeleton of the stable in the distance, then back at the woman beside him. Everything had been broken, but what was broken could be remade. "It needs to be rebuilt," he said, his voice still raspy from disuse. "The hands can fix it when you're stronger," she replied. He shook his head, a new resolve hardening his eyes. "No, we will fix it." And so the work began. It was slow and arduous at first. Luke was still weak, his left arm all but useless in its sling. But what he lacked in strength, he made up for in knowledge and will. He directed Mary Lou, teaching her how to select the straightest, strongest logs from the woodpile, how to score a cutting line with a chalk string, how to use a draw knife to peel away the bark, its clean, pine scent filling the air. She was a natural student, her hands clever and sure. She learned to swing an axe with a steady, rhythmic grace, the blade biting deep into the wood. She learned to mix mud and grass for chinking, her hands covered in the sticky, earthy plaster. They worked from sunup to sundown, a slow, patient team. The other ranch hands would watch them from a distance, a silent, respectful audience. Silas would bring them their meals, leaving the plates on a nearby stump, unwilling to intrude on the quiet, sacred work they were doing. They talked as they worked, filling the silence that had so often defined their relationship. He told her stories of his childhood on the ranch, of learning to ride before he could properly walk, of the wild, untamed beauty of the land he both loved and resented. She, in turn, told him of her life in Pennsylvania, of her blacksmith father's strong, kind hands, of her mother's garden, of a world of green hills and quiet towns that seemed a lifetime away. They were building more than a wall. They were building a bridge between their two worlds, weaving the threads of their pasts into a shared present. One day, as Luke was showing her how to notch a log to fit snugly into the corner, his hand covered hers on the handle of the adze. His was rough and calloused, scarred from a life of hard labor. Hers was smaller, but now bore its own testament to the work, with new calluses forming on her palms and a small, healing cut on her thumb. He turned her hand over and gently traced the lines on her palm with his finger. "You have good, strong hands," he said, his voice low. "They're not a lady's hands anymore," she replied, a hint of her old insecurity in her voice. He met her gaze, his pale blue eyes full of an emotion that made her heart ache. "They're the most beautiful hands I've ever seen," he said. As the last log was fitted into place and the new roof shingles were nailed down, a transformation occurred. The cabin was no longer just his solitary shelter. It was theirs. It was a testament to their shared resilience. Every new timber a symbol of their refusal to be broken. The day they finished, Mary Lou disappeared for a few hours. She returned with her apron full of something, her face glowing with a secret pleasure. While Luke watched from the doorway, she knelt in the dark, rich earth in front of the cabin, and began to plant. She carefully placed the roots of wild prairie flowers, Indian paintbrush, bluebonnets, and delicate primrose into the soil, creating a small, defiant patch of color and beauty against the stark, red-brown landscape. It was an act of pure, unadulterated hope. She was planting a garden. She was putting down roots. That evening, they stood together in the fading light, looking at their handiwork. The cabin stood strong and true, the setting sun glinting off the new wood. The small patch of wildflowers was a promise of future beauty. The air was cool and smelled of pine and fresh earth. "It's more than just a cabin now," Luke said, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes," she agreed softly, leaning her head against his good shoulder. "It's a home." He turned to face her, his expression serious, his eyes searching hers in the twilight. "Mary Lou," he began, his voice rough, "when I was lying in that bunk, burning with fever, the only thing that kept me here, the only thing I could see in the darkness, was your face. I've lived my whole life on this land, but I never understood what I was living for until you came. I love you." The words, so simple and direct, were the most beautiful she had ever heard. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of joy this time, and she let them fall freely. "And I love you." "Luke," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion, "this is not my home because of the land or the roof. It's my home because you are here." He gently cupped her face in his hand, his thumb stroking her cheek. That night, he said, his voice low and intense, "The night of the storm, when I saw you by the fire. I made a choice. I didn't know if I'd ever have the right to say it to you, but I'm saying it now." He looked deep into her eyes, his soul bared in his gaze. "I chose you then, and I choose you now, forever." He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of desperate passion, but of deep, abiding love, a promise sealed in the quiet dusk. It was a kiss that spoke of shared hardship and quiet victories, of a future to be built, log by log, day by day, together. The cabin behind them was no longer just a place. It was the heart of their new world, a home they had built not just with their hands, but with their hearts. The Texas wind, which had for so long been an adversary, a carrier of dust, a howler in the night, a thief of warmth, had become a friend. It carried the sweet, heady scent of Mary Lou's prairie flowers and the clean, sharp smell of the pine logs that formed their home. It was a wind of change, and it whispered of a future they were building with their own two hands. The decision to marry was not made in a moment of grand passion or with a bended knee. It was made one evening as they sat on the porch of their rebuilt cabin, watching the sun bleed across the horizon in strokes of orange and violet. Luke was whittling a piece of cottonwood, his hands, now fully healed, moving with practiced ease. Mary Lou was mending one of his shirts, her needle flashing in the fading light. A comfortable, domestic silence lay between them, as strong and true as the new walls of their home. "The circuit preacher is due in redemption next week," Luke said, his eyes on the piece of wood in his hands. He didn't look at her, but his voice was full of a quiet intention. Mary Lou's needle stilled. She looked at his profile, at the strong, steady line of his jaw outlined against the twilight sky. "Is he?" she asked, her voice equally soft. "Heard it in town," Luke continued. "Silas says he'll come out to the ranches to perform services for folks who can't make the trip in." He carefully shaved a long, thin curl from the wood. "Weddings, baptisms, the like." She set her sewing aside in her lap. That would be a kindness for many people. He finally stopped whittling and looked at her, his pale blue eyes searching her face. In their depths, she saw not a question, but an answer, an offer. "A promise, Mary Lou," He said, her name a quiet statement of fact. I want you to be my wife. She didn't need to consider it. The answer had been living in her heart since the day she had walked out of the Badlands, leading him home, and I want to be your wife. Luke, she replied, her voice steady and clear. There is nothing I want more. He reached across the small space that separated them and took her hand, his calloused palm enveloping hers. And that was all. No fanfare, no ceremony, just a simple, solid truth, stated plainly under the vast, open sky. News of the wedding spread not by invitation, but through the quiet, efficient grapevine of the ranch hands. There was no question of holding the ceremony in the main house or seeking the blessing of the man who lived there. Jedediah Carson remained a distant, formidable peak, shrouded in a cloud of impenetrable pride. He had not spoken a word to his son or to Mary Lou since the day she had defied him. He provided for the ranch, gave his orders through his foreman, but the heart of his kingdom had moved a few hundred yards west, to a small log cabin with a wildflower garden. They chose to be married on the low hill that overlooked their home. It was a place Luke had always loved, a place where the wind always blew, and you could see for 100 miles in every direction, the whole world laid out before you. The wedding day dawned bright and clear. Their guests were a small, loyal collection of souls who had witnessed their struggle and their triumph. Silas came, his one good eye crinkling with a rare smile, carrying a freshly baked apple pie as a wedding gift. Dusty and young Billy were there, their hats in their hands, their faces scrubbed clean and shining with awkward sincerity. A few families from the smaller, neighboring ranches, people who knew the value of a good neighbor and the power of a true heart, made the ride over, their children running and tumbling in the tall grass. Mary Lou's wedding dress was a testament to the life she had embraced. Days earlier, Silas had quietly left a bolt of fine, clean cotton sacking on her porch, the kind used for high-grade flour. It was a humble material, but under Mary Lou's patient needle, it had been transformed. She had sewn a simple, high-necked dress with long sleeves, its clean lines suiting her slender grace far more than any silk or lace confection from the East could have. She had embroidered a delicate vine of bluebonnets around the collar and cuffs, a touch of the wild beauty she had come to love. When she emerged from the cabin, her dark hair pinned up and woven with a few late-blooming prairie roses, a collective hush fell over the small gathering. She was not a wealthy bride, but she was a radiant one, her happiness a light that shone from within. Luke waited for her at the crest of the hill. He wore a clean shirt and his best denims, his scarred hands looking impossibly large and gentle as he twisted his hat brim. When he saw her walking toward him, the wind pressing the simple dress against her, her eyes fixed only on him, the breath caught in his throat. This was the woman who had faced down death for him, who had rebuilt his home and his heart. She was his miracle. As she reached his side, he took her hand, instead of a ring of gold or silver, a thing bought with money. He slid a small, wooden band onto her finger. He had carved it himself from the heart of the fallen oak tree, the wood dark and rich with age. He had sanded it until it was as smooth as polished stone, the grains swirling in intricate, natural patterns. It was a circle of promise, born of the storm that had brought them together, a piece of their shared history. The circuit preacher was a thin, kind-eyed man whose faith had been weathered and strengthened by the harsh realities of the frontier. He did not deliver a long, fire and brimstone sermon. He spoke simply of loyalty, of courage, and of the grace that could be found in building a life together in a hard land. When it came time for the vows, Luke turned to Mary Lou, his voice low and steady, carrying on the wind. I have nothing to give you but my hand, my heart, and my name, he said, his gaze locked with hers. I choose you, Mary Lou, in the dust and in the rain, in the hard times and the good. I will be your husband, your partner, and your home, forever. Tears welled in Mary Lou's eyes as she placed her other hand over his. I came here with nothing, she said, her voice trembling but strong. And you have given me everything. I choose you, Luke, to stand with, to work beside, to love. My heart is your heart, my home is your home. Forever. From the porch of the main house, Jedediah Carson watched the tiny figures gathered on the hill. He stood ramrod straight, a solitary, unmoving figure. He did not go closer. His pride was a wall he had built around himself, too high to climb and too thick to break. He saw the woman in white, the woman he had called a stray, standing beside the son who had defied him. He saw the community that had gathered around them, a family forged not by blood, but by choice and mutual respect. What he felt in that moment, a bitter regret, a cold fury, a flicker of grudging admiration, was a secret he would take to his grave. He only watched, and then, as the preacher pronounced them man and wife, he turned and walked back into the silent, empty house. The celebration that followed was not a grand ball, but a simple gathering of friends. They ate Silas's pie and roasted beef over an open fire. A ranch hand produced a fiddle, and the lively, scraping notes rose into the vast, star-dusted sky. Luke and Mary Lou danced, a bit awkwardly at first, then with a growing, joyful confidence. They were surrounded not by wealth or power, but by something far more valuable, a community that accepted them, a life they had earned, and a love that had proven stronger than greed, stronger than prejudice, and as resilient as the tough prairie grass beneath their feet. Time on the frontier was measured not in days, but in seasons. Summer bled into a mild, golden autumn, which gave way to a brief, sharp winter. With the spring came new life. The wildflowers Mary Lou had planted in front of the cabin burst forth in a riot of color, a vibrant testament to the hope she had planted in the hard soil. And with the spring came another change. One morning, the sound of children's laughter began to drift from the open door of the Carson cabin. At first, it was just the two young children of their nearest neighbor, a family struggling to make a living on a small, hard-scrabble plot of land. Their parents, who could neither read nor write themselves, had timidly asked if Mrs. Carson might be willing to teach their young ones their letters. Mary Lou had agreed without a moment's hesitation. They started on the porch, with Mary Lou using a charred stick to draw letters in the dirt. Soon, 2 more children came, then 3 more. The small porch became a makeshift schoolhouse. Luke, seeing the need, spent a week building a long, sturdy plank table and 2 benches, setting them up inside the cabin, which was now filled with the light from a new, larger window he had installed. The cabin, once a place of solitary masculinity, then a sanctuary for 2, had become something more. It was a beacon. It was a place of hope and learning in a world that was often defined by ignorance and brute force. Mary Lou, the orphan who had arrived with nothing, was now giving the most valuable gift of all, the gift of a future. One afternoon, Luke rode in from the range, tired and dusty. He dismounted by the corral and stood for a moment, watching his home. Through the open door, he could hear his wife's clear, patient voice. A is for apple, she said. B is for bluebonnet. C is for Carson. A small chorus of young voices repeated the letters after her. Luke leaned against the corral fence, a slow, deep smile spreading across his face. His father had wanted him to inherit an empire of land and cattle, a legacy of power measured in acres. But here, in this small log cabin filled with the sound of learning, surrounded by a garden of wildflowers, with a wife whose strength and love were the true foundation of his life, Luke knew he had found something far greater. He had not inherited his father's kingdom. He had built his own, and it was a kingdom not of dust and blood, but of hope and light. Thank you for listening to this story. We would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Night, and giving this video a like to help this story reach more listeners. You can also support us by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world to us.